All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. In order to set the stage, have you all had students who had Mr. Clark? Okay, you haven't, and you have. Well, I wanted to, for those who have not talked to Mr. Clark in a while, wanted to read you some quotes that'll kind of set the stage for the book. In the 2011-2012 school year, these three girls actually, Emily Gordon, Riley Casey, and Christina Forrest, followed Mr. Clark around during the year and kept a collection of quotes that he made. And they wanted to show everyone what he's like. So they by the end of the year, they handed him a book of 728 quotes that they had compiled throughout the year of all the weird things he would say. So I wanted to read from some of them just to set the stage for Mr. Clark. The more I yell, the more I love. It's kind of sick and twisted, isn't it? I have never actually eaten a kid. Now that can be taken so weird, but I could see him doing that. Where's my coffee? If you know Mr. Clark, you know he loves coffee. Soft and gentle don't have to go together. I'm neither. 7:07 a.m. and I'm already a jerk. If I was looking for perfection, I would look in the mirror. I'm not as evil as people say I am. Now, you guys know Mr. Philo. Do you remember the gym teacher? This is me, short and fat. This is Mr. Philo, long and loud. Where's Mr. Griffin? He's X, and nobody cares where X is. Do you often just randomly fall over? Better teaching through insults. There's a whole lot of attitude up there with nothing to back it up. Trombone players, you had one or two trombone players. Trombone players aren't afraid of trumpets, but they run in terror from the piccolo players. Come to my concert, you'll see the whole symphony orchestra accompanying me. I'm so tired of my own voice right now. More Rottweiler, less Chihuahua, and I'm comfortable with you people being mad at me. All right, now I wanted to start off by saying I am not a musician. So when I started this project, I knew nothing about music. I can't play an instrument, I can't sing. I try to in the car, and my son Casey says, shut up, or roll the windows up at least so no one can hear me bellow to Dell. So when I decided to shadow the Trotter Middle School Jazz Band, it was during the 2012-2013 school year. And I wrote a book about how the students of that year fared after one of their beloved schoolmates, Eric Green, died unexpectedly of an illness, an undiagnosed illness. And when I started this project, I was a blank slate as music started. How many of you guys know music or play music? 2.5 maybe. Well, I didn't know what things like fortissimo was. I had no idea that jazz tunes are sometimes called charts, or if the band director says pick up at 15, I didn't know what any of this stuff was. So I went through a severe learning curve. But I did know a couple things when I went into it. I knew that walking into that band room in Trotter, that it was filled with this gigantic personality known as Mr. Clark, who, if you haven't met him, he looks like Santa with a white beard and white hair. Even though he's in his 40s, he looks prematurely old Santa there. And I already knew him to some degree because my son Jonah, who's now a freshman in college, had played for him as a drummer in the jazz band. And I had seen Mr. Clark in action during many performances and concerts during my son's 6th and 7th grade years. And I knew this. I knew he was a showman, and I knew he was excellent in front of a crowd, had a very unusual sense of humor, and had charisma to spare. Now, after my son Jonah's good friend Eric Green passed away in January of 2012 from what was later found to be an enlarged heart, Jonah would tell me these stories about what was going on in school. He'd tell me how the students there were bonding together. They were bonding together and trying to get through their sadness together. He said they would go in, a lot of times they'd go into the band room, which with Mr. Clark in there, and that was a powerful place, some kids actually, when I've spoken to them, called it a sanctuary. They said this was a place where they could remember, where they could be. And one of the things that made it so safe was that they had this teacher there who let it be a place for them. Now, on what made me decide to write this book, it was at the end of that year, at the end of the 2012 school year. In June of 2012, they had their year-end jazz night concert. And I wore some hint of green because Eric's last name was Green, and so wearing of green was a symbol of remembrance. A lot of the kids up there had either a green necktie or green ribbons in their hair. I was in the audience, and I watched Mr. Clark guide those kids up there on the stage through the year-end concert. It was 6 months after their friend had passed away, and they were scheduled to play a piece that Eric had, the last piece that Eric had played in a concert, and had played it on his silver trumpet, which is one of the images on the front, is a silver trumpet. The piece was called Swing Shift, and a recording of Eric's solo was played at his funeral, and the kids all remembered that, and it haunted them. And they hadn't played it publicly until this night. And on jazz night, 6 months later, one of the trumpet players, an 8th grader, took what they called Eric's spot. And he was going to take over Eric's solo, and he was worried about it, and the kids were worried, how would we do? Now, I was a band parent. I was sitting in the audience, all prepared with tissues. I think I was sitting next to you, Gretchen, and we were all emotional and worried about how this was going to play out. How were the kids going to do? My son had told me everyone was fraught and worried beforehand. And as I listened, I was astounded. They aced this piece. These are 11, 12-year-old, 13-year-old kids, some in middle school, some have baby teeth, some need to shave, some are tall, some are short, and they were able to compartmentalize their feelings and play this piece. Now, I was a mess. I'm in the audience, I'm a mess. Other parents, you hear sniffling. They went up there and they played. And I kept thinking all weekend, how did they do that? How did they compartmentalize their worries and their fear and their emotions? And it bugged me all weekend. I was trying to figure it out. Finally, after talking to my husband, we said, you know what made the difference? It was this guy. It was the director, Mr. Clark, standing up in front of them. He makes it okay. He made it okay for them to make mistakes. He made it okay for them to just be the middle school kids that they were. He made them feel safe. He gave them a safe place to be. And the real life Mr. Clark is unlike anyone I had ever met. In the 2 years before I started the project, I knew some things about him. I would hear these really weird stories. And if you've had a kid in band, they would come home with weird stories from Mr. Clark's band room. Like Jonah, my son, would come home and say, oh, Mr. Clark was saying his cat was scratching him the other night while he was asleep, and he got really annoyed because the cat drew blood, so he threw the cat against the wall. And the kids were laughing, and they thought that was really fun. And he's like, oh, the cat was fine. And I'd say, he didn't really say that. And he said, oh, yeah, he would say that. Or he would say his belief that if you ate a lot of junk food and got really large, you could save the earth because you wouldn't need heat because you create your own heat. So he would come home, and Jonah would say, he said these things, and I'm like, I'm not sure I totally believe you. He told projectile vomit jokes. He told fart jokes. He told diarrhea jokes. And Jonah would tell me these things. I'm like, this must be part of the trick. This is how he gets them through these things. And I knew about this before I started the project. I knew he was a fan of big hugs. I knew he liked to eat. He would eat any food you put in front of him. I knew he had a reputation for protecting those kids. So when I thought about Jazz Night, when those heartbroken middle school kids played Swing Shift, the piece that they'd last heard over the speakers of the St. Matthew's Church at Eric's funeral, I decided I want to see how this works. I want to see how Mr. Clark works with kids in mourning. I knew that at the end of the next school year, they would do a memorial concert for Eric, that they were going to play 2 pieces commissioned for him. And I wanted to see how they got through it. Now, way back when I was in college, the kids would call it the Stone Age. I read a book by a local author named Tracy Kidder. He lives in Western Massachusetts, and he spent a year in a Holyoke, Massachusetts elementary school, and he observed all the socioeconomic problems that were dropped into the laps of teachers. And it was an amazing book that was a year in the life of this school, but you learned a lot more. And I said, well, what if I did that? What if I did that, the year in the life of this Southborough teacher? with these fragile kids who want to do well but get through a difficult period. And I went and I talked to, the first person I talked to was Mr. Clark, who within moments of me saying, well, could I follow you? Yes, I'm in. I'm like, wait. You have to check. Can you check? You should check with your wife. You should check with the principal. You need to check with school. He said, oh, I'm fine. And then he's already saying, I know who's going to play me in the movie. I'm like, you need to just chill. So he was on board right away. The hardest person to persuade to do this project was my son, because he said I was going to wreck everything, because I was going to be in the room. I would be the one hearing all of these weird jokes. And I said, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to be silent over there with my little notebook. And he finally warmed to the idea, particularly when the band would go on different trips. And I brought my wallet with me because I was following them. And then he could go, hey, can I have some money for the hot dogs or for this? I'm like, yeah, sure. So he was finally okay with it. So when the school year started, the 2012-2013 school year started, the big band students, they tried out and they were selected, the members were selected. Mr. Clark and I met with the parents. I promised I would give all the kids pseudonyms, and some of the kids said, can I pick my own pseudonyms? And I said, I don't know. And then one girl said she wanted to be Princess Elizabeth. And I said, no, we're not having a Princess Elizabeth. I said, so I did pick pseudonyms for all the kids, and I know I've had mixed responses on some, like, I hate this name, but that's okay. So all their names are changed in the book, and they were all on board. All the kids had the chance to talk to me twice during the year. I did a January set of interviews and then a June, and whoever wanted to talk to me could. And I was off. I was spending the year with the band. I was also getting to know Mr. Clark, and I met his wife, I met his daughters, I met his parents, I met his dog, I met his cat. We went to his hometown in Madison, Connecticut. I saw his childhood home, his high school where he made mischief, and all sorts of things. So I tried to learn, how did this guy, who was a professional musician originally before he was a teacher, how did he get to be the teacher that he is, and how did he help these kids? So I spent the year, and this is what I found. Now I'd like to read to you a few excerpts from the book. And the first one happened after the year that I shadowed the big band. It was on Memorial Day of 2015. And it was during a reunion of members of the big band. So these were kids from high school who went to Algonquin High School, who many of them had given up playing music after they left Trotter because they didn't want to play with anyone other than Mr. Clark. And you'll get a sense of how important being in this band has been for every kid, or most kids who've gone through this band program, and why this band program itself was something pretty special. Oh, and if you don't know, I think there's a reference in here. The Sonic Lords of Death refer to the trumpet section. So that's what that means. Okay. Let me get to the right page here. It was the evening of Memorial Day, May 26, 2015, and the band room was filled with the raucous music made by former members of the 2010-2011 big band. The group, which Mr. Clark said, put Trotter on the map. This is the band that set the bar for the rest of the big bands to follow. They took the big band on their backs and met every challenge, he told the 60 assembled family members and friends in the hot and humid room about the first Trotter big band to win an outstanding award at the University of New Hampshire Jazz Festival. I have missed them terribly. I love you guys. I love you dearly. These 27 teenagers, 9 of whom were on the cusp of college, were drawn back to their middle school band room to soak in this warm embrace set to music. The high schoolers were the catalysts behind organizing what they called the Mr. Clark reunion. Since they'd left Trotter Middle School, many confessed they'd longed for the connection, the camaraderie, the joy of the big band. Nothing had been able to fill that space in their hearts that was once occupied by the experience of playing in this place with this man. So bereft that Mr. Clark wouldn't be able to be their band director beyond middle school, a number of these teens gave up playing music. This reunion, this playing of 6 big band pieces, whose sheet music some of the students still had in their possession, was the first time many of the teens had played jazz music in years. With only an hour of rehearsal beforehand, followed by a buffet smorgasbord pulled together, about which Mr. Clark later observed, a smorgasbord of food. That was what I lost my place. With an hour rehearsal beforehand, the big band graduates delivered a concert about which Mr. Clark later observed, "It was messy and raw, but God, was it good." Excuse me. "They just wanted to be with Mr. Clark," said Deb Keefe, the mother of Brian, a junior. Brian and his Southborough band friends had been aching to reconnect with Mr. Clark, to play with him just one more time. These were the students I'd seen flock to the band room before big band performances with the express purpose of giving their old teacher an enthusiastic bear hug. The ones who formed at the Human Tunnel after jazz night. They were the same people I witnessed embracing Mr. Clark before town parades as the marchers gathered in downtown Southborough, including the boy who wept when I asked him what playing for Mr. Clark in the band room meant to him. Their desire to revisit their middle school years, to be those awkward adolescents, was palpable. You could see a similar sentiment reflected in their parents' eyes, which pooled in response to the bliss of their children's flushed faces as the students played groovin' hard like they just had rehearsal the day before. Their playing was explosive and jubilant. With just 4 trumpet players, they sounded powerful, like true sonic lords of death. The former band members responded to Mr. Clark's gestures, sometimes before he even made them. Lost my place. Like the entire saxophone section rising as one during the measure which showcased them in grooving hard. It was as if they'd stowed away the knowledge they accumulated during their middle school years and put it in a dusty box which they reopened only in this room. Mr. Clark wore a droll smile on his reddened face. His tone when talking with them wasn't that of a teacher leading a bunch of 11 and 12-year-olds. It made me think of something then 8th grade guitarist Jesse said when I interviewed him a few days after his trotter career came to a close. It's almost effortless with him. That's what makes him such a great teacher. That's why everyone loves him. Okay. So that was when I think there were 2 members of the band that I followed were in that reunion band, but a lot of them were older students. Now the next segment starts at the beginning of the first chapter, which confusingly enough starts at the end of the story. It starts at the end of the school year that I followed them. It starts on Jazz Night of June 2013. It was the very last performance of that big band at the end of an emotional year, a year of goodbyes. And this excerpt puts the spotlight on a then 6th grader, known as Henry. Mr. Clark always blows all the pseudonyms. He's like, "Oh, you mean that was?" I'm like, "Shh, none." But his name is Henry, who had to take the place of the top trumpeter after the top trumpet player became ill at the last minute. Henry was particularly worried about playing the lead in the piece written to honor Eric Green, which was called Kaleidoscope. Okay. The lead trumpeter was hurtling down the Massachusetts Turnpike en route to the hospital in the midst of a mid-June thunderstorm. He was supposed to be prepping to play a significant solo in the jazz piece Kaleidoscope, a complex tune composed in honor of one of his bandmates who died the previous year at the age of 12. But instead of settling into their auditorium seats, Patrick's parents were rushing their youngest son to the hospital, hoping to get there before his appendix burst. Back in the band room, Patrick's absence was sorely felt, especially by the 6th grade trumpet player who had been asked to take his place. When Mr. Clark told Henry that he would have to take Patrick's top spot, Henry's round face grew a little gray as his mouth fell open into a soft and horrified O. It was bad enough that the 6th grader was already terrified about whether he'd be able to make it all the way to the end of the longest concert of his life, where the students were expected to play 16 songs. Henry was already prepared for his lips to go numb, which a lot of kids told me their lips go numb. By the end of the night, by the end of the final bluesy notes of Sweet Home Chicago rang out into the night air. Numb lips were one thing, but stepping into Patrick's shoes as the top trumpet player for the unorthodox, trumpet-laden piece just 17 days after its premiere, that seemed like a lot to ask. Henry, who was physically smaller and slighter than many of the other 33 members of the big band, barely said a word all year during the group's thrice weekly before school rehearsals. He usually tried to blend in with the other trumpet players in the back row, ducking behind his scratched black metal music stand, hoping the booming voice of the short and barrel-chested Mr. Clark would never be aimed in his direction. I don't think I heard him speak ever, except at this night. Most of the time, it seemed as though Henry wanted to hide, despite the fact that he was playing one of the louder instruments in the band. But on this hot June night, jazz night, when the audience would include former big band members and a professional saxophonist, Henry couldn't hide because Mr. Clark wouldn't let him. All right, now, I wanted to, this next excerpt shows some of the things that the band parents never see, the kind of crazy, weird conversations that go in ways I can't even graph on a chart. And they were supposed to be preparing to play at a benefit concert for a symphony that Mr. Clark belongs to in Milford. And they couldn't stop obsessing over something called chicken in a can. Now this features prominently in this next section, and visual aids have helped. I actually spoke at a middle school, and I was using a PowerPoint, and the minute I put that on, they all went, oh! So this is what Mr. Clark will be talking about. This is the image he walked around the class, showing the class. It's boneless chicken in a jelly sort of thing. So that's to keep in mind. Here, if you'd like, you can pass it along so everybody can see.
It's like a chicken.
Yes, it's a whole chicken in a can. Yeah, see, that's why people need the visual for this. All right, so this is from the chapter called, cleverly enough, Chicken in a Can. Chicken in a can, that is what dominated the rehearsal, not the fact that their work would be showcased in 2 weeks in front of a local orchestra's annual fundraising dinner. The road to the subject of boneless chicken in a can was a winding one. It was so noisy in the band room before rehearsal started that I couldn't even tell what song Mr. Clark was playing over the speakers. A large number of students seemed to be in a chippy mood. Ethan grumpily plopped himself down on the front row, arriving 10 minutes late, but lucky for him, the rehearsal hadn't begun yet. And this section features Ethan, who is a saxophone player, and Danny, who is the resident comedian. And so the two of them have a little bit of a back and forth here. Picking up on Ethan's mood, Danny decided to tease him. "Ethan, how was your breakfast?" Danny shouted in a cheery, sarcastic tone. "I didn't have breakfast this morning," Ethan said, sounding defeated and a little hungry. Why this exchange led to Mr. Clark revealing to the group that his sister-in-law, Casey, hated eating chicken meat off the bone, I will never understand. I didn't understand half of the tangents that went on. He further shared that one night a friend had told him there was such a thing as canned boneless chicken. After learning this, he said he looked up chicken in a can on his computer when he got home. The images Mr. Clark found showed slick-looking chicken covered with a gray gelatinous jelly. That sounds so good. I hope you guys have already eaten. He emailed the links to KC, who he said was unamused. So for her birthday, he told everyone, I'm going to send her a case of chicken in a can. So this was exciting material for everyone to ponder because they really didn't want to play in a mellow tone again. They'd rather think about this. Talking about chicken in a can obviously called to mind a notion of digestive unrest, diarrhea specifically, which is a favorite topic of Mr. Clark's. Must be part of the magic for getting these kids to play. It was at this point in the conversation that Danny introduced the notion of gas station sushi, which one might reasonably conclude could also lead to diarrhea. Although the question of which would be worse, chicken in a can or gas station sushi, was up for vigorous debate. Now, I felt like I had to bring a barf bag to have for these rehearsals. As my delicate stomach churned, I was relieved when Mr. Clark changed the subject and called for them to play cute, reminding the trumpet section not to play angry. Jesse, who wasn't as absorbed by the gross food discussion as the rest of his friends, was obliviously strumming on his guitar in the back of the room. While the students took out their music, Jesse continued playing a song I couldn't discern, although I knew it was not cute. Mr. Clark glared at the guitarist, prompting Jesse to turn red for the 1,897th time this year, and he stopped strumming. But chicken in a can would not be denied. Mr. Clark himself kept the subject going when he declared they should write a tune called Chicken in a Can. This declaration was akin to a verbal flashbang device being dropped into the band room. After everyone reoriented themselves and the ringing in their ears stopped and their vision readjusted, they exploded with possibilities of setting an ode to deboned canned chicken in jelly to music. Students shouted out suggestions at the same time, talking over one another like pundits on a TV cable program. There was a jumble of words that brimmed with excitement bouncing off the walls, accented by laughter and gaiety. When the conversation showed no signs of ending, Mr. Clark tried to pull back the animal he'd unleashed. "Stop working on chicken in a can," he half shouted, half laughed. Not long after he attempted to guide Martin, who was one of the drummers, in the proper tempo for tiny capers, he stood behind the boy and gently tapped on his shoulders to the beat that he wanted him to replicate. Danny mentioned the topic du jour again. He said he was going to open up a restaurant. It was going to be called D Chefs, as in Danny Sheffield, and that he was going to serve chicken in a can, gas station sushi, and have a catapult on hand. And no, I did not understand the catapult, but that was part of Danny's charm. Although Mr. Clark asked them to pull out the music for Finding You Here, he continued to contribute to the madness by pulling up an image of chicken in a can on his iPhone and walking around the band room to show it to everybody. The photo reminded me of the Passover food gefilte fish, a pickled fish meatloaf of sorts that is sold in glass jars and filled with a gelatinous substance that I think resembles mucus. That gelatinous mucus image was on my brain when they played a sloppy, uneven rendition of Finding You Here. Then he made this reference, which only adults would get, and the kids it went over their heads. "It's like pulling back the covers and finding chicken in a can in here," he said, a reference to The Godfather's horse head in the bed. And the kids had no idea what he was saying. The following day, the last Friday in January, upon entering the band room and finding it only slightly warmer than the sub-zero temperatures outside, the whiteboard on the front of the room had the beginnings of a score for Chicken in a Can written in it in black dry erase marker. I prayed silently that there would be no more talk of that culinary oddity, the idea of which had torpedoed my appetite the day before. So that's that conversations would go in bizarre. There were talks of eye deodorant, like, because there was a discussion of BO, and then it went into body deodorant, putting deodorant on one's eyes. Like, the conversations went all astray. But when I would talk to Mr. Clark later, I said, "Well, do you do this on purpose? Do you try to say these crazy things?" And he said, "Well, sometimes kids get too obsessed with being perfect. They want the piece to be perfect. And this year, with this group of kids, they were so worried that any imperfection, especially on any of the pieces related to Eric, would communicate somehow a disrespectful attitude. Or they didn't want to disrespect Eric. They wanted it to be great. So he once told me that he asked the kids to write on the top of their music, "Look at the big idiot in the front of the room." And he said that he did this in front of the principal, and the principal's like, "What is this?" And he said, "Well, I want them to think I'm the biggest idiot in the room. And if I'm the biggest idiot, they can't be idiots. And they can try, and they can put themselves out there, and it's okay." So I don't think he went into classes or rehearsals with a plan. I just think that he would sense if they're too worked up, too tight, I have to do something, and he would do crazy things. He would lay on the floor. Like, there was a scene where one kid had a stomach bug, and ran out of the classroom, and he was becoming ill in one room, and the kids just decide to play on their own. So they play. Then Mr. Clark gets him. The kid is taken by the nurse to the nurse's office. He seems to be okay. I'm sitting there going, whoa. And then he comes back, and he just decides to lie down on the floor in front of them to make a point that their playing was making him sleepy. And I'm thinking, the boy just went, like he just, but I kept myself quiet. But he tried a lot of things. And the biggest challenge of this year was dealing with their grief and the survivor's guilt about their death of their friend. And so the hardest piece that they played was called Kaleidoscope, written by composer Eric Morales. And playing this piece, he had to figure out ways to push-pull to get them out of their comfort zone. Now the piece itself, even though I'm not a music aficionado, by the time I actually heard it, I'm like, this doesn't sound like anything I've ever heard. And he agreed. He said, this is not what I was expecting. It was not what the kids were expecting. When the kids first got the music, they hated it. They actually hated it. Mr. Clark is like, how am I going to conduct this? This is Eric's piece, and I hate it. And the kids they had a really hard time with this thing, but we have to ace it. Plus, it focused on the trumpet section because Eric was a trumpet player. And the trumpet section was the weaker section in this band in this particular year. So you had this pressure about mastering it, doing it right. And then you had this one girl, the only 8th grade girl who was in the trumpet section. She was the only 8th grader in the trumpet section. She used to stand next to Eric in the trumpet section. She said she'd never done a solo, but she said, I'm doing it for this because I owe him. And she was very bashful about this, very scared. And so Mr. Clark had to think of a way to try to get her to do this. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he persuaded her to do it, gave her a lot of support. And then on the day that she was going to perform it at the Eric Green Memorial Service, the first time it was going to be performed with Eric's family there. There had been speeches. She was really hyperventilating behind the scenes, really worried, but he knew how to motivate her. So I'm going to read a bit of the student named Lauren, who's playing her first solo in Kaleidoscope. Okay. And it starts off with Mr. Clark standing in front of the band. I don't think I have that picture up here. He had this clattering that he would wear, and he would, when he was nervous, he'd fiddle with it. And I would text him the weirdest questions. I said, you wear your clattering in your left hand or your right hand? I said, and he's like, what? I said, you wear it, because I have a picture of you with like fiddling, I can't see. And he's like, that's a weird question. But so he always, when he gets nervous, which he says he doesn't, he fiddles with his clattering. Fiddling with his clattering on his right hand, as I confirm, a nervous tick of his, Mr. Clark faced the crowd and introduced Kaleidoscope. The students learned the next piece, written for Eric, in difficult circumstances, he said. The level of dedication and sheer heart of the students in mastering this piece will be obvious, Mr. Clark continued. Mr. Morales, the composer, wanted to do something that's kind of different because Eric was kind of different. Before he started, however, he said, there is a young lady, referring to Lauren, who is scared about doing her first trumpet solo, especially in this song. But he was certain, he told the crowd, that she would have all the support of everyone in the room when she plays. No matter how she does, which given her emotional state beforehand was a question mark, the crowd would have her back. Now, I didn't know he was going to do this beforehand. I was appalled. I'm sitting in the audience going, oh, did he run that by her? I found out later he did. So she was not surprised. I was, but she was not. It started with Mr. Clark snapping his fingers. 1, 1, 2, 1, 2. I can't see. I'm not a musician. I can't do the right tempo. He silently drew a large circle in the air in front of him, that warm, round ball of sound. For the first 15 seconds, which featured the trumpets cascading and crisscrossing lines of sound, things were a bit unsteady. The trumpets weren't uniformly strong. The students' musical confidence wavered. After watching the uneven progress of this piece for weeks, I was worried. By 15 seconds in, the pianist The quiet yet elegant stick of a girl, Olivia, laid down the haunting and moody melody on the shiny black grand. It was as though a kaleidoscope had clicked into place in their minds. When the fluttering horns returned, I could hear their strength blossoming. By the 1-minute mark, I kept saying, wow, to myself. This did not sound like the same kids who, just 2 weeks prior, had no idea what to do with this piece. The complexity and volume of the tune surged just before Lauren took in a deep breath for her solo. She hit the first note. It wasn't the loudest note or delivered with absolute certainty, but it was even, as were all the other ones she nailed for the rest of her solo, maintaining a glass-smooth delivery throughout. I could feel the whole band saying, "Okay, Lauren, you got this," Mr. Clark said later. For a full 10 seconds, applause and appreciative shouts for Lauren drowned out the band. Relieved, she wiped her mouth with the back of her right hand, quickly glanced out at the audience, exhaled through her mouth, and cracked a tiny smile. There was still a lot of territory to cover. Kaleidoscope was far from over. So those are just a sample of what they went through that year. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer. I know you guys, a lot of you already have music students. Any questions from the crowd? I know, wiping away tears. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.